My name's Timmy Joe, making videos about computers on the internet. How's it going, guys? I'm back with another video, and today I wanted to start a little new series on the channel here. Basically, I've been, playing with an FX, little 9590. And I just did a video and I included a max overclock in it of 5.1 gigahertz. And I've come to realize that I have been pretty poor in this journey of overclocking the snot out of anything and everything, as showing the exact methodology or settings I use in specific CPUs and specific use cases. And I thought I'd start a new series when I do get my hands on a piece of hardware like the AMD FX 9590 that I'm running a system on right here. I'm going to show how I arrived at my final overclock. That way, this might not be something that's viewed a lot of times right away, or maybe you're a fan that has a nice FX processor and you're wondering how I squeeze that extra little juice out of there. You'll be able to refer to this video, and there'll be actual video of the BIOS. So a few things to keep in mind. When overclocking a processor, you're going to want proper cooling and keep your motherboard type and your motherboard, the chipset and stuff like that in mind, and do your research. It's as simple as I have an overclockers.net webpage in front of me. It's an overclockers guide for Piledriver, Bulldozer, and it's as simple as Googling, FX 9590 or Ryzen 5 1600 max overclock or overclock settings, or going to YouTube and doing the same. Typically, you will find somebody who has done a guide and varying degrees of difficulty and what have you, and it might offer suggestions as to things you should do to prep to kind of maximize the overclock, knowing that full well that Ryzen 5 1600 with the Wraith cooler on it, the might hit 3.8 gigahertz and actually have decent temperatures. I have an AIO on this because I know when I'm going to do some extreme overclocking, I'm going to need some pretty hefty cooling. And in doing the research and finding a video of somebody doing the overclocks on YouTube and seeing what kind of solution they're using, that'll help you in your journey. So I have basically, I've Googled this before. I've been looking to, different videos and stuff like that to see just how crazy people get without, using LN2 or some sort of exotic cooling solution. And right here is a very good, I'll link this one in the BIOS below for the FX. Very good FX or AMD Bulldozer. This pretty much applies to all those overclocking guide. But think about, I have a really good motherboard. It might not be the best case scenario. It's an 890 series FX board, which is basically the high-end AM3 motherboard that with a BIOS update allowed AM3 Plus CPUs to work on it. I'm fairly certain that it's an Asus Crosshair board. It's going to do very well in overclocking, and I will not benefit from having a 990. But I've overclocked with even a 970 series chipset before and had no problems. But keep in mind, you're going to think about heat sinks on your VRM and stuff like that. Looking at the motherboard itself and seeing this picture here, making sure that there is proper cooling or the power delivery, which gives the juice to the processor, because you're going to need a proper motherboard. You're going to want to maybe do some research on the motherboard you have, make sure it is a good overclocker and what have you. So you can check out the link below to this overclocking guide if you want some paper instructions, but I'm here to provide video instructions. So basically I have the BIOS here cleared. Okay, and I spent quite a bit of time researching this BIOS, making sure I got the max out of this chip before my video. But the stock frequency on the 9590 looks to be, at least according to this motherboard, 4 gigahertz with some probably boosting and stuff like that all on its own. But we want to eliminate any auto settings. So we're going to go down here to Overclocking Tuning Utility, and sorry, AI Overclock Tuner, and we're going to change this to DOCP. Now, what this is before, a couple of years ago, this is what XMP was. It's basically, it looks at your RAM and it will overclock your RAM based on its speed. So the default speed here was 1333, and it automatically bumped the speed of my RAM up to 1600 by going to DOCP. But in doing so, it also adjusted the timings and probably changed the voltage. So XMP profile, which is Intel's version of like checking out the RAM and overclocking it manually to a setting that's supposed to be registered for that RAM, might also be called DOCP in an older AMD motherboard, so keep that in mind. Other options in here is you could just straight up manually tune everything, but I'd rather have the RAM taken care of. So you can check the speed of your RAM and the timings right on the side of it. But this isn't a RAM overclock video, but keep in mind you want to at least stick around the speed that your memory says and not go too much further beyond it. And it is possible, and we'll see in a second, to change settings that affect both the overclock of the CPU and the RAM. So we'll keep that in mind. So this is an unlocked processor, and you might want to check what the multiplier people typically use to achieve overclocks, because on the FX series you can actually overclock the CPU by going with the CPU ratio. You can also change the CPU bus frequency, and that will increase the speed on the RAM and the CPU. We're going to do both today because a mix of those two things actually gets you your max overclock. How's it going? So, right off the hop, CPU core ratio, if we click into this, you might actually even have a graphical user interface for your, like a UEFI, basically a like windowed out version of your BIOS for an FX series motherboard, for sure. Like that's a thing. In the 9 series, you're going to see that a lot. This particular one looks more like DOS, but the settings should generally be pretty close to the same. You're just going to be using your mouse to achieve these settings. So I want to go, I think 24. Yeah, I think it's 24.5 is where we're going to hit with the CPU ratio for this particular overclock. That's going to land our CPU at 4.9 gigahertz all the time. Okay, there is different levels that the motherboard will automatically apply to increase frequencies on this chip. Like you might get a couple of cores hitting 5 gigahertz or 4.8 gigahertz. At stock settings, well, we want all the cores all the time to be a certain frequency. And now keep in mind this will dramatically increase how much power your stuff's sucking. So let's go over here. So we're also going to turn AMD Turbo Core technology off. That is what I'm talking about. Automatic boosting of the frequency. We want to turn that off because we want to control the overclock all the time. There is still some power tables that are at play here, like it will actually step the frequency down all on its own, but we don't want it stepping the frequency up all on its own. That's the thing, okay? So we'll go down here and CPU bus frequency. If I plus this or minus it, you see my RAM is increasing its frequency, and that's what I was talking about. Now we can actually offset this. So if I add, I think we're going to get this up to 5.1 gigahertz. That's where I was. That's just adding 8 points to the CPU bus frequency. That's actually fine in my case. I'm going to overclock the RAM. Just 64 megahertz, it'll be fine. But in some cases, you might actually want to increase that CPU bus frequency a lot more. And when you do that, you can change its under DRAM frequency. You can step it down to 1387 here, and then you could keep putting your CPU bus frequency up. And if we look at the top here, that's going to increase the overclock on our CPU and RAM, and you could eventually get back to that 1600 megahertz that your RAM allows for. But we're not going to touch that. We don't have to with my particular setup. I don't want to overclock the RAM any more than a little bit past 1600, and we can do that. But I'll switch this back to 1688, and put this back to 208. So right now my CPU ratio is at 24.5 and my CPU bus frequency is at 208. Now we're going to definitely need to adjust some voltage settings from here on out. But it's as simple as those couple of settings. Enabling the XMP or DOCP profile for your RAM, adjusting your CPU ratio, and adjusting the CPU bus frequency if necessary, and there you go. So now we're going to go down here into the voltage settings, and this motherboard doesn't have a direct voltage control, meaning I can't just say, hey, use 1.45 volts. There is an offset that it does here. So there's also some other things we need to look at, like load line calibration. Load line calibration, when you're at the bleeding edge of your overclock, it's a setting that basically increases a little bit of voltage when you're doing heavy loads, like right at the beginning, because if you just hit Cinebench, it starts blasting your cores with work to do. All of a sudden, it might not have the voltage to keep up on the end of the power supply. So what load line calibration does is, before that big load hits, it actually boosts up the voltage so that when that droop hits, it doesn't affect stability. If you don't have load line calibration in your BIOS, it's something to look for. Make sure that, if you want to be overclocking, that is a definite setting in pretty much from this FX series all the way up to, a Coffee Lake or a Ryzen CPU. It's a setting you're going to want to see. It's called a couple of different things, but load line calibration, definitely something you want. Now, in this motherboard, I don't have very much control. Sometimes you can plug in a percentage of load line calibration. There are other things you can do here. I can either go 0, 50%, or full calibration. I actually need to do CPU and B load line calibration to and CPU load line calibration to full calibration in order to maintain stability with this high overclock. Now keep in mind, I've got an AIO on this. I've got very good airflow. I purposely took the front end of this case off, and there's tons of fans blasting around the power delivery, and there is a pretty good heat sink and heat pipe on the power delivery on this motherboard. So the power delivery temperatures were never an issue while I was overclocking, but you might have a different motherboard that has no heatsink on the VRM, and that could be a problem, so keep that in mind. You might even have to straight up put a fan on your VRM for an FX series processor to get past 5 gigahertz. So CPU offset voltage, this is what I was talking about, and it gets confusing to not just be able to dial in your settings here. I would love to just straight up in here put 1.45 volts, but I end up having to kind of guess. Because I'm going to go a full 0.1 ahead of the curve. Now, you'll see my BIOS is actually changing the color. It went from white to now yellow. And if I keep going, this will actually turn red to indicate I'm well above where I should be for voltage. Here, if I go 0.2, yeah, I see it turns red. So it kind of gives you an indication you're going way too high with that. There's also extreme over voltage. You might want to enable or disable that. Enabling that will actually allow me to go really high with voltages before it shuts the computer off, because you're basically saying, hey motherboard, I don't care if I fry my CPU with some over voltage. You won't fry your CPU, but you might have to do that to hit some really high voltages to do some really high overclocks. I enabled it, but it might not even need to be enabled. I also know that my voltage only needs to be 0.1 offset, which ends up putting it very close to 1.5 volts, if not beyond it, because it's offsetting that green number, which is 1.38. So it's ended up going to be 1.48 or more. As for other voltage settings, you might have to play with some of these in some situations. If you find a specific overclocking guide for some specific processor and you're on the bleeding edge, I myself left all of this other stuff to auto, And the one thing I'd be concerned about is my RAM voltage, DRAM voltage here. It's very, very high, 1.56. It'll actually go up to even 1.6 on auto, but the rating on the RAM of this DDR3 is pretty high, 1.5 volts. So it's automatically adjusting for some overclocking and stuff. You might also, you see CPU spread spectrum. People turn that off. I don't know if that affects stability or not. I'm not exactly sure what that setting does, I'll admit. I'll also admit that I just go in here and I play around and I match people's settings. I am absolutely no expert, but I don't want to discourage you. Go in here and play around. You're not going to break anything. Worst case scenario, you'll have to take the battery out of your motherboard and unplug it for 5 minutes and then put it all back together and it'll probably work, or hit the button that resets your BIOS, or switch to your secondary BIOS. There's lots of different things you can do to if you screw up an overclock. One of the generous things about the FX series I find, typically it will post, like it'll boot and start loading Windows even at very, very unstable high overclocks, so you typically just to get to restart and then go from there. So this is pretty much all the settings you'll need to change. You could also, if you want to go into CPU configuration, there's one thing you definitely, if you're highly overclocking, you'll want to change, and I forget where is it. CPU load line, I think it's in advanced. CPU configuration, AMD cool and quiet, turn that off. There you go. And that should be about it. Now, while I'm in here, you're going to want to go to hardware monitor and check on your fan speed control. This will be a lot easier in more modern BIOSes if you have a UEFI where you can change your CPU fan curve settings and stuff like that. All this is disabled by default, which means the fans are just freaking on. They're just straight up on full blast. But I'm going to go in here and I have some non-PWM DC fans on the CPU right now, and I'm going to not set it to, I'm going to set it to standard. The AIO is just fine. One other thing I'm going to change is chassis Q-fan control. The chassis header, I hooked the pump up to that. I'm going to want to enable Q-fan, enable Q-fan control, and then put this to turbo. That's going to make sure my pump is pretty high rate of speed when the CPU is at load or the CPU temperature is high. Other than that, fairly certain that is where my overclock was. So save settings, boom. We'll go into Windows and we'll do a quick check on stability, and I'll show you how I do that. A lot of the times when I'm showing max overclocks in my videos, I will admit I am not like testing them to for full stability. I am just simply trying to get max overclocks on a specific CPU, and I will use Cinebench over and over and over again to try and validate an overclock, but that does not mean that looks like I was already in here. Interesting. That does not mean that the CPU is stable. If you're going to test stability, you're going to want to program like Prime 95 or AIDA64 and do like a burn-in test where you stress the CPU on and off for an hour minimum. And that's going to assure that you're not in the middle of a game with your awesome high overclock and things get too hot and just boom, shut down. But typically in my videos, when I'm talking about a high overclock, I got the thing Cinebench stable, which is not necessarily, that's bench stable. That's not, perfectly stable. So we've got our hardware monitor here is a program you're going to want. There are several different, there's Hardware Info 64. This is the one I use, CPU ID's hardware monitor. And I typically look at CPU package temperature. That's generally the best place to look. I also really like this program because you can open it up right at the beginning of a boot and you'll see your core clocks there. And while your computer's booting, you can see the temperatures you're at, and you can also check and see where, make sure that your overclock applied. Because sometimes it looks like Windows booted under, with a great overclock. And you look in here and, especially with Ryzen, you're at 1600 megahertz when you think you're at, 4 gigahertz. And you're like, what the hell's happening here? So we see here our temperatures are rather in check. They're at 18, 15 degrees Celsius. 28 is our max, so that's interesting. That's pretty low temperatures, but we'll go ahead and do a Cinebench run. Cinebench R15, a very great program for overclocking because it gives you instant validation, okay? Especially with a fairly fast CPU. You can open it up and do a benchmark inside of 5 minutes and find out if your overclock increased the performance of your CPU, fairly quickly. That's why I love Cinebench. I know the numbers for Cinebench because it's just like, anywhere from 200 to 2,000 to 7,000. You're going to get a pretty general idea of the performance. Now, while we're running Cinebench here, we're going to look at our temperatures, and we're jumping up now near 70 degrees. It's a good idea also when you're doing an overclock to check the max temperature, okay? Because if instantly when you start running Cinebench you see you're into the 80s and 90s, on an FX that would be too much, okay? It doesn't like to go over 80 degrees probably before it starts throttling or just straight up shuts the computer down. Intel CPUs might go to 100. So do your research before you start your overclock, but don't be afraid to test some settings or increase very incrementally. So we got 760 Cinebench, so that's about near the max. If I closed hardware info and a few processes, I might be able to get closer to 800. But this is how I got to where this overclock, and it's generally pretty stable around 5.1 gigahertz. Any further than that, I might have been able to do one Cinebench run and then it shut off, and that's not good enough for me. I like to do multiple Cinebench runs in a row, and that's where I get my bench stable overclock. But we're seeing here the package is now getting near 70. But we check our vCore settings too, CPU vCore. Holy geez, load line calibration is pushing this thing up to 1.58 volts. That is very, very high. So that's the motherboard's load line calibration. Putting it up there pretty high. You also want to check your max voltages, okay, for a specific CPU. I know for a fact Ryzen is 1.425 is like generally the highest voltage you want to put your overclock at. Now, proper cooling goes a long way, but a lot of factors can contribute to stability issues, and you want to make sure you're not exceeding a very high vCore. We see here we're throttling because now the CPU's speed went down to 677, so the motherboard, something happened there and the CPU frequency throttled. So 5 gigahertz is probably the better option for an all-the-time overclock with a really good cooling solution on a 9590, or maybe even an 8350, any of the 8-core FX series processors. If you win, you're good on the Silicon lottery, you should get close to 4.8 to 5 gigahertz. But that's my settings for this particular overclock. I hope you enjoyed the video and you got to see, in the BIOS and kind of a little behind the scenes of how I get to where I go. But honestly, guys, it's as simple as, not being afraid to go look at some settings, change some settings, know how to reset your BIOS, have Cinebench, hardware info, and a stress testing program like IDA64 or Prime 95 installed to validate once you got a good overclock going that there isn't a stability issue. And like, let's say in my case here, I got this 5.1 gigahertz, and maybe I want to now dial the voltage back incrementally until I run into stability issues to make sure I hit that sweet spot of voltage. I might even get a better overclock if I lowered the CPU multiplier and increased the frequency, the bus frequency. You could play around with that, but I've already done all that, and this is pretty much where I end up with this CPU. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this helps you out. If you have any questions, I typically answer a degree of comments below. Please consider backing me on Patreon. That helps these videos happen. I am currently working a full-time job, and it's very hard to complete videos and justify things. I'd love to get to a point where I've got enough Patreon backers and the channel's got enough subscribers that I get the opportunity to do this, you know, a lot more, if you get my drift. I also would love to receive some cool hardware from you if you have something. I'm currently looking for maybe some early core i5, i3, i7 stuff. In the Sandy Bridge area. I'd love to get a motherboard like with a 2500 on it or something like that. That's stuff that's kind of hard to come by because people really hold on to those things. But if you've upgraded, and I don't know, I'm just throwing that out there. Looking for that, any old cool GPUs, Fermi-based stuff. I still haven't received a Fermi card, like a 480 or a 580 from NVIDIA. That would be pretty cool. Or some, whatever. I'll leave it up to you guys. But thanks very much for watching my videos. I hope this helped you out. If you have any questions below, and this is how to, overclock an AMD FX processor. You might have more settings in the BIOS. You might have less. You might have that graphical interface or the text-based interface I had, or a graphical one. But those are generally the settings you need to change to achieve a pretty high overclock. But I'm not saying this is the end-all be-all of guides. Keep doing your research beyond what I'm telling you, and you should be okay. But thanks very much for watching. See you guys in another video. This has been a long one.